Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty big, an idea that shaped drug policy for decades really. Marijuana as a gateway drug.
It's a really persistent narrative, isn't it? This idea that using cannabis somehow automatically puts you on a path to, harder stuff like heroin or cocaine. It's definitely influenced laws, public perception.
Yeah, hugely. And for this deep dive, we're working from a really solid source you brought. It's a big review looking at all sorts of scientific evidence, right? Epidemiology, brain science, all focus on this gateway idea.
That's the plan. We're going to unpack what this review says, look at the evidence it gathers, and try to figure out what the science actually tells us about marijuana acting as, a gateway.
Okay, let's do it. So this whole gateway concept,
Yeah.
where did it even start? It feels like it's just always been there.
Well, the source traces it back mostly to the 1970s. It really gained steam then, partly pushed by groups like NSDUH, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and, it fit neatly into the whole war on drugs story.
Right. That makes sense. Very specific context back then.
Exactly. And what researchers were seeing observationally was this common sequence. People who ended up using drugs like heroin or cocaine often said, they started earlier with tobacco, alcohol, and then marijuana.
Ah, okay. So they saw that order, A, then B, then C.
And they jumped to the conclusion that A led to B, which led to C, a progression.
But just seeing a sequence doesn't mean one thing caused the next, right?
That's the immediate critique the source makes, and it's fundamental. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because marijuana use often comes before harder drug use doesn't prove, pharmacologically or otherwise, that the marijuana made it happen.
Okay, the classic statistics warning label. Always important. Like, more ice cream sales correlate with more drownings, but one doesn't cause the other. It's summer.
Perfect analogy. The sequence might be real for some people, but why it happens is way more complicated than just marijuana did it.
So if just observing the order isn't enough, what do the bigger studies, the epidemiology, actually show when they, dig into the numbers?
Well, large surveys, things like the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, the NSDUH, they do show a statistical link. If you average it out, people who've used marijuana are, statistically speaking, more likely to later report using harder drugs compared to people who haven't.
Okay, so there is a correlation in the raw data. It exists.
It does exist, but, and this is the really critical point, the source emphasizes that association. It often gets much weaker, sometimes it almost disappears when researchers start controlling for other factors, what we call confounding variables.
Confounding variables, right?
Yeah.
Remind us what those are again.
They're basically other things about a person or their life that could influence their likelihood of using any drugs. So things like their socioeconomic background, maybe pre-existing mental health issues like depression or anxiety, trauma history, even genetics or family history of addiction.
Ah, okay. So maybe it's not the marijuana pushing them, but these other underlying issues pulling them towards substance use in general.
That's precisely one of the main alternative explanations the source digs into. Once you statistically account for those potential influences, the unique link between marijuana specifically and later harder drug use looks much less like a direct causal relationship.
That really reframes it, doesn't it? It's less about the drug itself and more about the person's context. Does the source mention specific studies on this?
Yeah, it points to data from the Monitoring the Future study, MTF. That's a big one, tracking drug use in adolescents over many years. And MTF does confirm, yes, kids who use marijuana early, say in their teens, are statistically more likely to try other drugs later on.
Okay, see, that sounds like it could support the gateway idea, right? Early use leads to other use.
Well, yes and no, because the source immediately follows that up with a crucial finding from the same data. The vast majority of those early marijuana users do not go on to develop problematic use or addiction to harder substances. That's a really key point.
Wait, say that again? Most kids who try marijuana don't end up with serious problems with other drugs.
According to this review of the MTF data, absolutely. The source specifically mentions that across several years of data, something like over 60% of people who used marijuana reported using no other illicit drugs at all. So experimentation might happen, but it's not some inevitable slide into heavy drug use for most people.
Wow, over 60% used only marijuana among illicit drugs. That really punches a hole in the idea that it's an unavoidable stepping stone.
It definitely complicates that simple picture. The source also brings up a longitudinal study from 2006 by Ferguson and colleagues. They followed people over time and did find that using cannabis before age 15 was linked to a higher chance of developing substance use disorders later in life.
Okay, there's that correlation again.
It pops up, yes. But importantly, the researchers themselves, as cited in our source, urged caution. They pointed out that those confounding variables we talked about, trauma, peer groups, maybe genetic factors, could explain a large part of that link. They weren't convinced it was a direct causal effect from the cannabis.
So pulling the epidemiology section together, there's the statistical association, yes, but it shrinks when you account for other factors. And most people who use marijuana just don't progress to harder drugs.
That's a good summary of the source's take on the epidemiological evidence. It argues that the large-scale population data just doesn't strongly support a simple causal gateway effect driven by marijuana itself.
All right, let's shift gears then. What about the biology? Is there something happening in the brain, like pharmacologically,
Yeah.
that could create this gateway effect?
That's definitely been part of the hypothesis. The source mentions some animal research, like work by Hurd and others around 2007. They looked at how THC, that's the main psychoactive compound in cannabis, might affect dopamine pathways in rats.
Dopamine, the reward chemical.
Right. And these studies suggested that early THC exposure in young rats could potentially change how those reward circuits function, maybe making them more sensitive to the effects of other drugs later on, like morphine in their experiments. So a potential biological priming effect.
Okay, so in rats, there's some evidence suggesting a possible biological pathway. What does the source say about this translating to humans?
Well, this is where the source presents some strong counterarguments. First, human studies haven't really consistently found the same kinds of specific, lasting biological changes from marijuana use that were seen in those rat studies. It's harder to replicate. And maybe even more importantly, the source points out that other substances, specifically alcohol and nicotine, actually seem to have stronger evidence behind them for messing with dopamine regulation. And crucially, they're more consistently linked in studies to people later transitioning to illicit drug use compared to marijuana.
Whoa, hang on. So alcohol and nicotine legal substances might actually have a bigger biological impact in terms of like priming the brain than marijuana does based on this review?
That's what the evidence presented in the source seems to suggest. It also mentions neuroimaging studies in humans, like reviews by Volkow and others from 2014. These studies, looking at people's brains, haven't found convincing proof that marijuana uniquely primes the human brain for addiction to harder drugs in a way that's really different from or stronger than what you see with alcohol or nicotine.
So the biological mechanism idea, it exists in theory and maybe in some animal models, but the evidence for a unique, powerful, marijuana-specific biological gateway in humans just isn't strongly supported by the science reviewed here.
That's the conclusion the source draws, yeah. The neurobiological evidence for that specific claim seems pretty weak in humans.
Okay, so if it's not simple causation in the big picture data and the specific biological link for marijuana isn't robust in humans, then why do we see that pattern? Why do some people start with, say, marijuana and then move on? What else explains it?
This is where the source really leans into alternative explanations, these broader models. A key one is called the common liability model, which researchers like Volkow have discussed.
Common liability. Tell me more about that.
The basic idea is that some people just have an underlying general predisposition or vulnerability towards taking risks, including using substances. This vulnerability could come from lots of places: genetics, personality traits like being impulsive, maybe mental health issues, a history of trauma.
Okay.
So because these individuals have this sort of general vulnerability, they're just more likely to try various substances over time. They often start with whatever's easiest to get: alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, not because that first drug made them try the next one, but because their underlying vulnerability drives them to seek out different substances sequentially or even at the same time.
I see. So it's not about drug A causing drug B use. It's about person X being more likely to try both drug A and drug B because of their underlying makeup or situation.
Precisely. And the source really hammers this point. Studies show that starting any substance use early, whether it's alcohol first or tobacco first or marijuana first, is a predictor of later substance use problems. It doesn't really matter which one came first. That suggests it's the early use pattern itself linked to vulnerability that's key, not the specific substance.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. It shifts the focus back onto the individual and their circumstances. What about their actual environment? Does that play a role?
Absolutely critical, according to the source. Environmental and social factors are huge, and they often tie into that common liability idea. Peer pressure, it's a big one, obviously, but also just plain excess.
Access. How does that fit the gateway idea or challenge it?
Well, think about it. For many young people, marijuana is often the most readily available illicit drug. And where do they get it? Often in social settings or through networks, where unfortunately other illicit drugs might also be present or obtainable from the same people.
Okay, right. So it's not the marijuana chemically opening a door, but using it might put you in a situation, a place, or a social circle where other doors become visible or easier to open.
Yeah.
A situational gateway.
Exactly. It increases the opportunity for exposure. And the source makes a really fascinating, maybe even counterintuitive point related to this. It cites studies showing that teens who get their marijuana from illegal dealers are significantly more likely to be offered or encounter harder drugs from those same dealers.
Wait, really? So buying illegally actually increases your exposure risk to other stuff through the seller.
That's what the cited research suggests. And this leads the source to float a pretty interesting implication. Maybe, just maybe, legalizing and regulating marijuana could actually reduce that specific risk pathway. If people buy it legally, they're not interacting with dealers who might also be pushing heroin or cocaine.
Huh. That's a really interesting angle, especially now with legalization spreading so much across the U.S.
It really is. The source notes the landscape in 2025, over 40 states with medical cannabis, more than 20 with recreational. This real-world experiment is giving us tons of new data on how legalization actually impacts things.
So has this wave of legalization actually shed any light on the gateway theory in practice?
Well, the source points to one particularly striking study. It was by Anderson and colleagues, published in JAMA Psychiatry in 2021. They looked at opioid overdose death rates.
Okay. What did they find?
They found that states which had implemented legal access to marijuana actually had lower rates of opioid overdose deaths compared to states where marijuana was still prohibited.
Whoa, lower, not higher. That seems completely backwards if marijuana is supposed to be a gateway to harder drugs like opioids.
Exactly. It directly contradicts what a simple gateway theory would predict. It suggests something much more complex is happening. Maybe in some cases, access to legal marijuana is acting as a form of harm reduction. Perhaps people are using it to manage chronic pain, maybe as an alternative to or even substitute for highly addictive prescription opioids. Or maybe it changes other risk behaviors in ways we don't fully understand yet. But it definitely challenges the idea that more marijuana access inevitably leads to more hard drug problems. It could even potentially be the opposite in some scenarios.
Fascinating. So given all this, the weak epidemiological causation, the lack of strong, unique biological evidence, these alternative models, and now this data suggesting maybe even harm reduction. What does this mean for public health policy and how we talk about drugs?
The source argues it means we need a major shift. We need to move away from the really simplistic, often fear-based messaging that's centered on the gateway idea for so long.
And move towards what instead?
Yeah, towards approaches that are actually based on the evidence we have now. That means more nuance. It means things like harm reduction strategies, providing accurate education about the actual known risks of marijuana use, especially for young people, and, really importantly, focusing way more attention on the root causes of why people develop substance use disorders in the first place.
Root causes? You mean like the things we talked about with common liability, mental health, trauma?
Exactly. Tackling poverty, lack of opportunity, untreated mental illness, history of trauma. The source suggests that focusing on those underlying vulnerabilities will be far more effective than just warning people that marijuana leads to heroin.
So it's about understanding the person and their context rather than just vilifying a specific substance based on its place in a potential sequence.
That seems to be the core message, yes. And the source is careful to point this out, this doesn't mean marijuana use is risk-free, especially for adolescents. While the evidence reviewed here doesn't support the gateway theory as a primary driver, early and heavy marijuana use is still associated with certain risks.
Right. What kind of risks does the source still acknowledge?
Things like potential negative impacts on cognitive development in adolescence, problems with school engagement, potentially leading to dropout. And yes, there's still that statistical association with using other substances later, even if it's not primarily causal in the gateway sense we've been discussing. Those other factors, the common liabilities, still mean early users are a group at higher risk overall.
So prevention is still important. We still want to discourage early use. But the reasoning behind that prevention message should be grounded in those actual documented risks, not based on the gateway idea which the science doesn't seem to strongly support.
Precisely. The source advocates for prevention efforts that are honest about the real, evidence-based risks, cognitive effects, school issues. The risk of dependence on marijuana itself, rather than relying on what it suggests, is an outdated and scientifically shaky gateway narrative.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up then. Based on this deep dive into the source material, what's the bottom line on the marijuana gateway theory?
The clear conclusion from the scientific review presented in this document is that the available evidence does not support the claim that marijuana use, because of its inherent biological or pharmacological properties, directly causes people to progress to using harder drugs.
So the drug itself isn't the main culprit driving that progression.
That's what the source strongly suggests, yes. It concludes that the statistical link we observe is much better explained by those other factors we've discussed. The shared underlying vulnerabilities captured by the common liability model, and crucial environmental factors like social networks and, importantly, access through illicit markets.
And the gateway theory, just on its own.
The source basically says it's too simple. It's an insufficient explanation for the complex reality of why some individuals develop polysubstance use patterns. It's a much more tangled web of individual predispositions, social context, and opportunity.
That really does demand a more sophisticated way of thinking about substance use, doesn't it? It's not just about one drug leading to another in a straight line.
Exactly. It pushes us towards needing these nuanced, evidence-based strategies that look at the whole picture: mental health, trauma support, social determinants of health, early intervention for any risky substance use, instead of just focusing narrowly on blocking the use of one specific substance based on where it falls in a common sequence.
This has been incredibly illuminating.
Yeah.
Really digging into the science behind such a culturally embedded idea like the gateway drug. It shows how critical it is to keep examining the evidence, even when it challenges long-held beliefs.
It really does. It's a great case study in how science evolves and helps us refine our understanding of really complex public health issues.
So just a final thought for you listening to this. If we accept what this review suggests, that progressing to harder drugs isn't mainly about the marijuana itself, but more about these underlying vulnerabilities and the person's environment, what should that mean for how we try to prevent substance use problems?
Yeah, it raises a big question. Have we been putting too much emphasis, too many resources into fighting cannabis specifically, maybe using that gateway angle, when perhaps those resources could be better used tackling the deeper issues? Things like improving mental health care access, addressing childhood trauma, reducing poverty, factors that make people vulnerable to all kinds of substance misuse.
And looking forward, what could this shift in understanding mean for public health policy around all substances? Should we maybe focus more on supporting overall well-being, resilience, and healthy environments, rather than waging war on specific drugs in a perceived pecking order? Definitely something to think about.
Indeed, the science seems to point towards a more holistic and perhaps ultimately more effective and compassionate approach.
Thank you so much for walking us through that complex research. And thanks to all of you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this gave you some new perspectives to consider.